Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to reach your ears. For over 2 centuries, the soil of America has kept a secret, a war buried beneath polite textbooks, silenced in classrooms, and scrubbed from the mouths of teachers. A war so relentless, so defiant, that if men today truly understood it, they would never again bow their heads to chains of any kind. The Gullah Wars, the longest, bloodiest, and most successful slave rebellion in U.S. history, and yet you've likely never been told their name. Why? Because truth, my friend, is the most dangerous weapon in the world, and those who hold power know that memory itself can burn down empires. Picture it: the swamps of Florida, the coastal lowlands of Georgia and South Carolina. The year is 1700. The Atlantic slave trade is in full force, human bodies shipped like cargo, shackled and broken. But here, in the humid, mosquito-filled wetlands, a different story is unfolding. The enslaved, stolen from the rice kingdoms of West Africa, carried something far deadlier than chains could crush: knowledge. They knew how to work rice, how to survive in waterlogged soil, how to build communities in secrecy. And they carried memory, whispers of freedom sung in rhythm, buried in story, hidden in prayer. These whispers would one day erupt into a rebellion so vast that it threatened the very survival of the young United States. But you don't know about it. Why? Because the story of the Gullah people is a story of defiance, of black men and women who refused to die on their knees. And if you, sitting here in the modern age, were to fully grasp the extent of their victory, their relentless decades of war against the U.S. military, you might begin to wonder, what else have they hidden from me? What else has been erased? The silence is not accidental. Imagine a history book in a public school boldly declaring, "The enslaved did not submit. They fought, they resisted, they bled for generations, and they won battles against the United States itself." Imagine young men reading that and realizing that rebellion is not only possible, it is inevitable when truth is known. That is why you've never been taught the Gullah Wars. The truth begins in the rice plantations of the coastal Carolinas. European planters brought West Africans not only because of their bodies, but because of their minds, because those men and women carried centuries of agricultural genius. The Gullah language, a Creole tongue rich with African cadence, grew in isolation as they outnumbered whites in those regions. The overseers were often absent. Plantation owners lived far away in Charleston or Savannah, and so the Gullah shaped their own world. In these cracks of neglect, a dangerous idea flourished: independence. They built communities, retained African spirituality, and created a cultural backbone strong enough to withstand terror. And when opportunity came, they struck. Escaped slaves fled south into Florida, into the swamps, into Spanish territory, where they forged alliances with the Seminole people. They became known as Black Seminoles, armed, disciplined, and determined never to be captured again. From the early 1700s to the 1840s, they waged a guerrilla war against U.S. forces, a war so savage and unrelenting that it cost the American government millions of dollars and decades of blood. This, my friend, is not a story of submission. It is a story of a hidden nation within a nation. But here's the knife twist. The U.S. government did everything in its power to bury their existence. Presidents sent armies. Generals wrote reports filled with rage. Politicians whispered in fear that the rebellion would spread like wildfire across the plantations. Because if enslaved men across the South believed the Gullah could win, every plantation could erupt overnight. That terror haunted Washington. That terror rewrote history. And so they tried to silence it, erase it, lock it away in footnotes no one reads. You are being handed a forbidden truth. To hear it is to feel the ground shift beneath your feet. What you were told about history, that the enslaved simply endured until benevolent politics freed them, is a lie. The reality is darker, bloodier, more powerful. Freedom was fought for, taken by force, seized in the swamps with fire and iron. The Gullah Wars were not a footnote. They were America's nightmare. And if you lean closer, I will take you into their world, where chains broke, blood boiled, and silence was shattered by the will to be free. But I must warn you, once you descend into this history, you cannot go back to ignorance. You will begin to see patterns in media, in government, in the stories men in power want you to believe. you will see that control is not just about armies and laws, but about memory, what you are allowed to remember, what you are forbidden to recall. The Gullah Wars were not just a rebellion. They were proof that men, once united in purpose, can tear down the strongest empire. That is why they were erased. That is why you've been kept blind. So I ask you now, do you really want to continue? Do you want to step off the path of comfort and into the swamp of hidden truth? If so, stay with me, because what comes next will strip away the last illusions of the story you were told. We will walk into the darkness of rebellion, hear the whispers of those who refuse to kneel, and understand why this truth was buried beneath centuries of lies. This is not just history, this is forbidden knowledge, and once it lives in you, it will never let you sleep the same again. Close your eyes and picture it. The swamps of Florida at night. The air is thick, alive with the hum of insects, the stench of stagnant baby dune. Otter. Spanish moss dangles from trees like the tattered veils of ghosts. A man moves silently through the darkness. His skin is scarred, his back marked by the whip of bondage. But in his hands he carries a musket. He is no longer a slave. He is a soldier, a rebel, a shadow in America's nightmare. He is Gullah, and he is not alone. This is where the story of the Gullah Wars sharpens its teeth. From the early 1700s onward, groups of enslaved Africans fled south, escaping the plantations of the Carolinas and Georgia. They slipped into the swamps and merged with the Seminole people, Native Americans who had already learned to resist foreign domination. Together they forged something unprecedented, an alliance of the hunted. Two peoples who refused submission, who understood that survival meant not only hiding, but striking back. By the late 1700s, these communities were more than scattered bands of fugitives. They had become organized, fortified, and unyielding. They built settlements deep in the wilderness, where no cavalry could easily reach. They planted crops, trained warriors, raised children in freedom. To the American government, they were a cancer, a living reminder that slavery could be broken. To enslaved men still in chains, they were living legends. Word spread quietly across plantations. In the swamps, there is freedom. In the swamps, the black Seminoles live armed, unchained, undefeated. Do you understand the danger of this? America was founded on a system of control. Plantations were not just farms, they were engines of wealth, producing rice, cotton, and sugar that fed global empires. Enslavement was not simply cruelty. It was the foundation of power. Every dollar in a planter's pocket, every brick laid in southern cities, every barrel shipped to Europe, all of it depended on obedience, on silence, on broken spirits. But the Gullah shattered that silence. They refused to be broken. And when one community resists, others begin to imagine that they can resist too. This is why the Gullah Wars are buried. Because for decades they fought the United States military to a standstill. Think about that. Trained soldiers, backed by federal funding, marching into swamps to hunt down rebels, only to be ambushed, cut down, driven back. Guerrilla warfare at its deadliest. These men and women knew the land, knew the water, knew how to vanish like smoke. They did not fight in neat lines on open fields. They fought in shadows, in silence, striking fast, disappearing into terrain that devoured armies whole. The First Seminole War erupted in 1816, but in truth the fire had been smoldering for generations. U.S. forces marched south to destroy what they called the Negro Fort on the Apalachicola River, a fortress built by free black men and women, stocked with cannons, ammunition, food, a beacon of defiance. Imagine the terror that fortress represented to the U.S. government. An independent black stronghold on American soil, a declaration carved in stone and gunpowder that freedom would not be begged for. It would be seized, defended, lived. The fort was bombarded, destroyed, its defenders massacred. But did the rebellion end? No. The survivors melted into the wilderness and kept fighting. Again and again, U.S. soldiers marched south. Again and again, they found themselves caught in an endless war, bled by an enemy they could not break. The Second Seminole War stretched from 1835 to 1842. the longest war the United States ever fought against native or African-descended people. It cost tens of millions of dollars, drained the treasury, and left generals frustrated and humiliated. Yet even after 7 years of blood, the Gullah and Seminole resistance refused to vanish. Why have you never been told this? Because it rewrites the narrative you've been fed since childhood. You were told enslaved men were passive, that they waited for emancipate, iron handed down by politicians and paper. You were told resistance was rare, crushed quickly, insignificant in the grand scheme. But the truth is the exact opposite. Resistance was constant, unrelenting, and often victorious. The Gullah Wars proved that enslaved Africans did not merely dream of freedom, they took it with fire and steel. And here is the darkest revelation of all. The government knew it. The politicians knew it. The generals wrote it in their reports. They knew these wars were not small skirmishes, but existential threats to the system of slavery itself. If the rebellion spread, the economy of the South would collapse overnight. Imagine tens of thousands of enslaved men abandoning the fields, joining armed black Seminoles in the swamps, carving out free nations beyond the grasp of planters. America itself would have been torn apart before it even grew to power. So they buried it. They silenced it. They told you nothing. They replaced the truth with stories of benevolent masters and political compromise. They gave you a version of history that makes you weak, docile, convinced that freedom comes only when powerful men allow it. But the Gullah Wars prove the opposite. Freedom comes when men seize it, when they refuse to kneel, when they burn the system that cages them. Do you feel it yet? That pull in your chest, that discomfort in your gut? That is truth waking up inside you, a truth you were never meant to hold. History was weaponized against you. You were raised on stories that strip you of fire, that cut your spirit at the knees. But now you know, hidden in the swamps, for decades, men like you fought and bled and killed for freedom, and they nearly won. The descent has only begun. We are entering a world of shadow, of silence, of rebellion whispered in blood. And the deeper we go, the more you will see how power works, not just in the past, but in the present. Because once you understand how they erased the Gullah Wars, you will understand how they erased truth itself. You will begin to see the machinery of forgetting. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. You've heard fragments of the war, ambushes in swamps, fortresses blown apart, soldiers stumbling through the muck, stalked by men who refused to be slaves. But let us go deeper. Let us walk inside the battlefield of the Gullah Wars, because only then will you understand why this history was buried and why it threatens to resurrect itself in your mind right now. The year is 1835. The United States government has grown tired, desperate, and afraid. Florida is not yet a state. It is a frontier bleeding chaos. The Second Seminole War erupts, and at its heart are the Black Seminoles, Gullah warriors who had once been bound in chains, now turned into America's most elusive enemy. On December 28, 1835, U.S. forces march under the command of Major Francis Dade. 100 soldiers trudging through wilderness, heavy packs on their backs, muskets clutched in their hands. They believe they are on routine patrol. They believe the road is clear. But hidden in the trees, 200 Seminole and Black Seminole warriors lie in wait. For hours they watch in silence, every heartbeat pounding with fury carried across generations. And then, in a single thunderclap of gunfire, the illusion of American dominance shatters. The first volley cuts through the air like a storm. Soldiers fall where they stand. Chaos erupts. Men scream. Horses scatter. Within minutes, the road is painted with blood. Dade himself collapses, riddled with musket balls. Only a handful of survivors crawl back to tell the tale. The rest are swallowed by the earth, buried in the silence of the swamp. History remembers it as Dade's massacre. But the truth? It was not a massacre. It was a message. The enslaved do not wait for rescue. They rise, they resist, they strike. But here's the sickening twist. The U.S. government did not trumpet this story as a tale of defiance. They reframed it. They called it savagery, painted the Seminoles and their black allies as monsters lurking in the shadows. They could not afford to let this story inspire. They had to twist it into fear, to remind white citizens of a lurking threat, not to remind enslaved men of the possibility of freedom. You see the tactic? This is not just war with bullets, it is war with memory. And the memory war was even deadlier than the battlefield, because after every ambush, every skirmish, every fortress that rose and fell, America rewrote the script. Soldiers' journals spoke of terrifying enemies, skilled fighters, men who seemed impossible to defeat. But when those stories reached the public, they were filtered, sanitized, reframed. The newspapers would whisper about runaways instead of warriors. They would diminish the scale, obscure the victories, bury the truth beneath words chosen to strip these men of dignity. This is the machinery of erasure, and it is still used today. Think about it. What you remember shapes who you are. What a nation remembers shapes what it becomes. If they can decide which battles to record, which names to glorify, which wars to elevate into legend, then they can decide the future. They can control the imagination of millions, because a man without memory is a man without weapons. So ask yourself, why does every schoolchild in America know the name of Paul Revere, but not the name of the black Seminole warriors who bled the U.S. military dry for 7 relentless years? Why are you taught about George Washington crossing the Delaware but not Dade's defeat in Florida? Why do you see statues of Confederate generals but not monuments to the enslaved who burned their chains in fear? Because if you knew, you might start to wonder why obedience is the only story you've been told. You might begin to see the hidden pattern. Control the story, and you control the people. Strip a man of his heroes, and he forgets he has the power to resist. Replace stories of rebellion with stories of patience, and you teach entire generations to wait, to beg, to obey. That is the deepest scar of all. Not the whip on the back, but the whip across memory. And yet, buried beneath centuries of lies, the truth still whispers. Imagine the nights in those swamps, fires burning low, children gathered around as warriors told them of the battles fought that day. Imagine the songs sung in the darkness, voices weaving together African rhythm and native cadence, proclaiming that freedom was worth dying for. That memory, that living flame, could not be fully erased. It lived in bloodlines, in fragments of stories, in the very soil of Florida and the Carolinas. It lived long enough for us to rediscover it now. Do you feel the weight of this revelation? You were not meant to. You were meant to grow up blind, repeating the myth that history moves forward because leaders make speeches, because documents are signed, because power is benevolent. But the Gullah Wars prove otherwise. Progress is not given. It is taken. It is ripped from the hands of those who would deny it. And when you understand that, you cannot unsee it. You begin to notice every manipulation, every silence, every place where the truth has been amputated from your memory. But here is where the descent grows darker still. Because the Gullah Wars are not just about the past. They are a mirror. They reveal how power works now, how governments, corporations, and institutions twist reality before your eyes. What you are allowed to know, what you are told to believe, what you are conditioned to forget, all of it is part of the same machinery. If they could erase the greatest slave rebellion in American history, what else do you think they are erasing today? Pause and breathe, because this truth is heavy. History is not just a record of the past, it is a battlefield of the present. And you are standing in the middle of it, whether you realize it or not. The stories you accept, the heroes you honor, the myths you believe, these are weapons forged to control your soul. The Gullah Wars show you what happens when men refuse to be controlled. That is why they were buried. That is why you were never supposed to hear this. But now you have. And once this knowledge lives in you, it begins to change you. A man who knows the truth can never be ruled as easily as a man who believes the lie. So let me ask you again, are you ready to go deeper? Are you ready to see how the chains of memory are forged? How obedience is carved into your mind? How rebellion is not just an act of the past, but a choice waiting in the present? Then stay, because the next step in this descent will show you the tools of psychological control that bind you even now. The same tools once used to bury the Gullah Wars, now sharpened to keep you silent in a world that fears your awakening. Listen, power does not fear open force alone. Power fears memory more than musket fire. It fears the story that shows the oppressed rising, organizing, and winning. So it learned to fight invisibly, not with soldiers on the field, but with books in classrooms, with plaques on courthouses, with the soft, steady drip of acceptable narratives that dull men into obedience. The machinery that buried the Gullah Wars is the same machine that polishes myths into gospel. It's subtle, patient, and relentless, and it is operating right now. Begin with the classroom. Children do not arrive in society with politics, they arrive with wonder. The first person who shapes that wonder controls how the next generation will perceive possibility. In the Oath, textbooks were edited, revised, and curated by committees who understood that certain stories had to be promoted and others quietly starved. What passed for history became a narrative engineered to keep a social order intact, the planter as patriarch, the union as inevitable, rebellion as anomaly. The curriculum offers you heroes who fit a convenient mold and omits those who do not. You're taught origin myths that comfort, not those that incite. A boy grows up reading about dignified leaders and constitutional compromise and never learns about guerrilla warfare in the swamps, about the black forts that held, about the women who smuggled arms beneath skirts. That absence is deliberate. Memory is a resource. When you starve a generation of certain memories, you starve them of the capacity for revolt. Then there is the press, the lens that frames a century in a few columns. Newspapers in the 18th and 19th centuries were partisan engines, financed by merchants and politicians with stakes in the status quo. When the Gullah and black Seminoles ambushed troops or held territory, the press did not print "rebels seize fort." They printed "savage attack" or "runaway band threatens civil order." Words shape emotion. Emotion shapes action. Action shapes history. The press turned insurgents into monsters, and monsters do not inspire sympathy or imitation. They inspire fear. Fear breeds loyalty to institutions that promise safety. See how the pattern repeats. Whisper a lie enough, and it becomes the scaffolding of obedience. Archival control is another blade in the same hand. Who gets to decide which records are preserved, which letters, which journals, which oral histories are catalogued and stored? Governments and universities maintain archives that shape every historian's starting point. If those who hold the archives neglect the records of black-run settlements, if they classify oral tradition as folklore rather than evidence, they render resistance invisible. The Gullah Wars survived in fragments, in discarded military reports, in the testimonies of black elders passed mouth to mouth in Spanish records from Florida. But those fragments were inconvenient, messy, hybrid, and difficult to fold into neat national narratives. So they were sidelined. Archives became a sieve that filters out inconvenient truths. Monuments and memorials do their part too. Walk through any southern town and you'll find public memory carved in stone, statues that honor Confederate officers, plaques that sanitize plantations into genteel estates. Public spaces tell a story, whose sacrifice matters, whose lineage is honored, whose suffering is memorialized. Monumental choices are not innocent. They are deliberate acts of cultural design. If you celebrate generals but not revolters, you consecrate one set of values and bury another. Memory is architecture. Those who design it choose who stands at the center of the national gaze. The legal system and economic incentives tighten the noose further. Laws criminalize escape and partnership with escaped people. Bounties turn human beings into commodities. Legal rhetoric frames rebellion as treason rather than legitimate warfare. Plantation economies lobby for legislation that further entrenches silence. Fugitive slave acts, extradition agreements, military directives. Economic clout buys narrative control. Newspapers are financed by merchants who benefit from the status quo. Universities accept donations that come with conditions. Culture bows to capital and law. It's an ecosystem designed to preserve hierarchy. What about language itself? Language is a tool of colonization. The Gullah Creole, a language born from resilience, was denigrated as broken English, a sign of inferiority. When you call a culture's language inferior, you delegitimize its history, its intellect, its capacity to record truth. Those who speak a discredited tongue are easier to ignore. The Gullah people's stories, their strategies, their songs, all coded in a language deemed unworthy, were thus relegated to folklore and superstition. The very code that allowed them to survive was turned against them by those who refused to listen. Then there's institutional amnesia, the quiet, bureaucratic haze that consigns inconvenient records to the dustbin. Generations of academics trained to value certain methodologies over oral history reinforced the blindness. Those who sought out Gullah testimonies found doors closed, grants denied, journals uninterested, tenure committees skeptical. Scholarship became gate-kept by standards that favored written documentation over living memory, a bias that conveniently erased communities whose histories were preserved in the mouths of elders and the rhythms of song. The system preferred neat footnotes and pedigreed sources. It rejected living proof. This is bureaucratic violence. And finally, the cultural marketing machine, film, fiction, and entertainment, creates the myths that stick. Hollywood sews together images that appeal to the comfortable. Rebellion is either glamorized into spectacle that strips it of meaning, or demonized into horror that isolates it from moral legitimacy. Rarely is rebellion portrayed as disciplined, organized, and morally justified. Instead, narratives are packaged to soothe the anxious majority. Rebellion is an outlier, not a model. A man raised on those films will internalize a soft obedience, a belief that revolution is messy and morally ambiguous rather than sometimes necessary and righteous. Do you see how comprehensive the machine is? It's everywhere. Education, press, archives, law, language, culture. Each part reinforces the other. Each omission compounds the next. Together they form a fortress around collective memory. And when a truth threatens the walls of that fortress, the machine acts. It marginalizes, it reinterprets, it relegates, it forgets. It did this to the Gullah Wars. It does it to every inconvenient revolution. But here is the real lesson hidden in this darkness. The machinery that erased 1,000 warriors in the swamp is not external to you. It operates inside you too. You have been trained to accept sanitized stories, to prefer comfort over cognitive dissonance, to believe that authority is the same as truth. To break that programming, you must first recognize the palace of forgetting that has been built around you. You must learn to ask not just who is telling the story, but who benefits from its telling. This is why the Gullah Wars matter now more than ever. They are a masterclass in resistance and in the art of being forgotten. To know them is to expose the blueprint of erasure. Once you see how memory is manufactured, you can begin to reclaim it. You can start to dig up the names they buried, to read the margins they left blank, to hear the songs that were never transcribed. And in doing so, you awaken not just to past rebellion, but to present possibility. Brace yourself. The next step will take us into the hearts of those who fought, the leaders, the strategists, the women who bore arms and children at once. We will name them and give them back the dignity stolen from their stories. We will trace the tactics they used, the alliances they formed, the betrayals they survived, because once you know their names and their methods, you cannot be controlled by silence any longer. Names have power. That is why so many were stolen. That is why the victors write history in ink that bleeds out every rebel's face, leaving only shadows on the page. But shadows cannot hide forever. The Gullah Wars were not just a vague uprising. They were led, lived, and fought by flesh and blood men and women who deserve to be remembered, and feared by those who profit from forgetfulness. Tonight, we resurrect them. Begin with the Black Seminoles, warriors descended from Gullah escapees who had slipped the chains of Carolina rice fields and fled south into Florida. They forged alliances with Seminole leaders like Osceola, a man whose name the U.S. military learned to curse. But understand this, Osceola was not alone. Beside him stood black commanders who organized militias, who understood not only how to fight, but how to keep communities alive while armies closed in. These were not runaways. These were tacticians. They knew guerrilla warfare, agriculture, and survival. Their children grew up free, their elders carried West African memory, their warriors carried powder and steel. One figure emerges in the records, John Horse, also known as Juan Caballo. He was a black Seminole leader, a translator, a negotiator, and a warrior who outwitted generals in both diplomacy and combat. His name does not appear in school books, but to the soldiers who faced him, he was unforgettable. He led hundreds, maybe thousands of men through battles that left U.S. officers staggering in confusion. Horse understood that rebellion was not only about the musket, it was about forging networks, protecting women and children, ensuring that resistance was sustainable generation after generation. Women, too, bore the weight of rebellion. While official records dismiss them as passive, oral traditions tell a different story. Women smuggled ammunition. They passed messages between villages. They raised children who never knew the taste of bondage. Some even carried muskets, fighting shoulder to shoulder with men in ambushes that shredded entire U.S. companies. The system feared them most of all because a woman who births in freedom, teaches in freedom, and raises sons who only know resistance is more dangerous than a dozen soldiers. She ensures that the fire does not die when one generation falls. The tactics were brilliant. Unlike the rigid formations of the U.S. military, the Gullah and Seminole fighters struck unpredictably. They used the swamp obi as a weapon. Soldiers weighed down with gear sank into mud. Rebels moved barefoot, silent, unseen. Where white officers saw wilderness, Gullah warriors saw home. Every bend in the river, every patch of high ground, every tree that could shield a sniper's barrel. They learned from centuries of African resistance. Strike, vanish, strike again. Every battle was a ghost war. To face them was to fight an enemy you could not catch, an enemy who seemed to melt into the land itself. And they knew psychology as well as terrain. They targeted supply lines, ambushed patrols, made every march a nightmare. Soldiers began to fear the silence of the swamp more than the gunfire itself. Fear is the first fracture in any army. Once soldiers believe the land itself hates them, discipline rots. The Gullah exploited that fracture with surgical precision. Do you understand how dangerous this was to the United States? If the methods of the Gullah Wars had spread across the South, every plantation could have become a battlefield. Every swamp, every backwoods trail, every river crossing could have been an ambush site. The slaveholding economy would have bled out. Banks would have collapsed. Planters would have fled. The young nation itself might never have survived. That is how close America came to being undone, not by foreign empires, but by the men it tried to chain. And yet, silence. Their names erased, their tactics dismissed, their victories downplayed. Instead of generals, they are called runaways. Instead of fortresses, they are called hideouts. Instead of wars, they are called disturbances. Language was the blade that killed them twice, once in the field and once in memory. But you are hearing their names now. Osceola, John Horse, the countless unnamed women who carried powder horns beneath skirts, who hid fugitives, who whispered freedom into the ears of children. At night, they are not gone. They live in you now because you know them. Memory resurrects, and with every name remembered, a chain rusts. Pause with me here. Think of the men in Washington during those years, men in suits and wigs, writing laws, counting profits, commanding armies. Imagine their fear. They sat in halls of marble, but in their minds they heard the echoes of muskets in the swamp, the cries of ambushed soldiers, the fire crackling in black settlements that refused to bow. They feared not just defeat, but contagion. The idea that rebellion is possible, that defiance is contagious, that freedom can be taken by the enslaved themselves. That fear is still alive in the halls of power today. And it should be. Because once men like you realize how much has been buried, you will not stop with one story. You will begin digging into every silence. You will begin to notice every manipulation. You will understand that your own life, your sense of possibility, your willingness to fight, your hunger for mastery is shaped by what they let you remember. And this is why I tell you, write their names down, whisper them, keep them alive, because the war for memory is still raging, and silence is the enemy's sharpest weapon. Now we stand at the threshold. You know the warriors, their tactics, their brilliance. But what of their legacy? What did the United States do to crush them completely? What weapons beyond the battlefield were deployed to erase them, to scatter them, to ensure you would never grow up knowing their fire? The next descent will show you not only the final battles, but the institutional strategies, the treaties broken, the forced migrations, the betrayals, the psychological warfare that sought to kill not only the body of the rebellion, but its soul. And when you hear it, you will understand that this story was never just about the past. It is about you. It is about now. And is about the system that still breathes down your neck, waiting for you to forget who you really are. The deeper you descend, the darker it gets. By the 1840s, the Gullah Wars had dragged the United States to the edge of exhaustion. Soldiers sent to Florida came back in coffins or not at all. Armies burned villages, destroyed crops, hunted families through the muck, and still the rebellion would not die. It was a war without end, and Washington knew it could not be won by force alone. So they turned to something older, colder, more insidious: betrayal. The U.S. military began to lure leaders with promises of peace, treaties inked with solemn words that were never meant to be honored. Osceola himself was captured under a white flag of truce, a violation so dishonorable it poisoned America's reputation even among its own men. Picture it. A leader walks into negotiations unarmed, believing in the sanctity of diplomacy, only to be shackled in irons and hauled away to die in prison. That single act revealed the true face of power. It does not negotiate in good faith when it feels threatened. It deceives, it lies, it pretends peace while sharpening its knife. But betrayal was not enough. They needed to dismantle the rebellion at its root. So they turned to forced migration. The infamous Trail of Tears was mirrored by the brutal expulsion of black Seminoles and their allies. Families were marched west at gunpoint, torn from the swamps that had been their fortress. Communities that had thrived for generations were uprooted, scattered across Oklahoma, Texas, and even into Mexico. This was not just relocation. It was psychological warfare. Take a people from the land they know, from the rivers, trees, and soil that give them strength, and you wound their spirit. You cut the tendons of rebellion. But the black Seminoles refused to vanish. Many fled across the border into Mexico, where they struck new alliances and carved out pockets of freedom far from the reach of Washington. For decades, they served as border scouts and mercenaries, warriors who refused to be broken even in exile. Think about that. Even after betrayal, even after forced migration, even after watching their leaders chained and their homes burned, they still refused to bow. And yet, the story was erased. The textbooks do not tell you about Osceola's capture under truce. They do not tell you about the black Seminoles in Mexico, living as free warriors long after slavery in the United States ended. They do not tell you about John Horse leading his people across the Rio Grande, about Gullah descendants who built new lives beyond the empire that tried to enslave them. Instead, they gave you silence. Instead, they fed you myths of submission. Understand this: the final defeat of the Gullah Wars was not military. It was narrative. The armies could kill bodies, yes, but they could not kill the idea of rebellion. Only silence could do that. Only erasure. And so the final victory of the United States was not on the battlefield, but in the classroom, in the centuries that followed, where this war was excised from memory like a tumor. Now you sit here, hearing it for the first time, and the question is, what do you do with it? Because knowledge is a double-edged blade. You can ignore it, let it fade, and remain the same man you were yesterday, or you can let it mark you, scar you, change you forever. That is the dangerous choice. That is the descent you are on. If you choose the descent, you must claim it. And you will claim it not in silence, but in words that cut through the algorithm, through the veil, through the very machinery that seeks to bury this knowledge again. Right now, I want you to comment these words twice as a declaration that you are not the same man anymore. I break the chains. I remember the forgotten. Type it once for yourself, and once for the others who will come after you. Men who will read your words and feel the pull of memory ignite in their chest. Do it now. The comment is not for me. It is for you. It is the symbolic act that tells the machine, I will not forget. I will not obey silence. Because silence is how they win. Memory is how you fight back. This is where the descent shifts. You now know the rebellion was real. You now know it was buried. You now know betrayal, forced migration, and psychological war were the final weapons used to silence the Gullah. But you are still standing. You are still listening. And now we must go deeper still. Because the lesson of the Gullah Wars is not only about history, it is about power itself, how it operates, how it seduces, how it manipulates. The same systems that erased the Gullah are the systems that whisper to you today, shaping what you believe, shaping what you fear, shaping who you think you are. And if you want to be more than a pawn, you must learn to see the system clearly, to see its wires, its gears, its illusions, to recognize propaganda when it whispers, to recognize control when it masquerades as truth, to recognize obedience when it is dressed as morality. In the next descent, I will show you how. Now that you have seen the battlefield, the betrayal, and the erasure, it is time to confront the most insidious weapon of all. Control that lives not in muskets or fortresses, but inside the mind itself. The Gullah Wars teach you a lesson far beyond combat. They reveal the architecture of psychological domination, the system that buries truth while presenting obedience as virtue. And this system is still alive today, more subtle, more efficient, and infinitely more dangerous. Think of it as a network: education, media, law, culture, and technology, all working in concert to shape perception. They decide what stories you hear, how you interpret them, and which memories are safe to retain. The erasure of the Gullah Wars was not an accident. It was a test case in controlling an entire population through selective memory. They killed the story, and in doing so, they killed the fire of rebellion before it could spread. The lesson was simple: control the past, and you control the present. Control perception, and you control the future. Begin with education. Consider how curriculums are curated, which events are celebrated, which are relegated to footnotes. You are taught heroes who fit the narrative of obedience, generals who won with structure, presidents who negotiated peace, leaders who maintained order. The Gullah, Osceola, John Horse, none of these men and women appear. Their victories, their tactics, their defiance are hidden. Why? Because remembering them would teach an entire generation that systems of control can be challenged and broken. That is the blueprint of subversion. Then consider the press, past and present. Newspapers, television, and digital media filter events to fit a preferred narrative. Every story you read, every headline you consume, is selected with intent. Rebellion is either glamorized into spectacle, stripped of its strategic brilliance, or demonized to instill fear. Context is removed, nuance is erased, and historical continuity is sacrificed. This is propaganda refined over centuries. The narrative is a cage, invisible but inescapable. Language itself becomes a tool. The Gullah people's Creole, their words, their oral history, were labeled as folklore, insignificant, or primitive. The effect was the same as erasure, a culture brilliant in its survival strategies reduced to myth. Today, language continues to be weaponized. Words are reframed, labels are applied to manipulate perception. Terms like extremist, conspiracy, or misinformation are modern equivalents. They filter what you can believe, where you can search, and who you can trust. Institutions compound the effect. Governments, corporations, universities, each institution controls what is recorded, what is celebrated, what is funded. Archives are curated, journals published selectively, grants awarded to research that reinforces the preferred narrative. The Gullah Wars survived only in scattered Spanish reports, military journals, and oral histories. Scholars were blocked, sources ignored, stories silenced. Institutional memory is a weapon. Every time a story disappears from the curriculum, every time an oral testimony is dismissed, the machinery grows stronger. Now consider technology. Algorithms shape what you see, hear, and interact with. Social media feeds, search engines, streaming platforms, each is programmed to prioritize certain truths while burying others. The effect is chilling. You live in a curated reality, unaware that an entire dimension of knowledge has been filtered from your perception. The same way textbooks erased the Gullah Wars, modern algorithms erase inconvenient truths. The difference is now you participate in your own erasure. You scroll past, you click, you like, and the machine learns what to hide next. But here is where it becomes dangerous and personal. This system is not just external, it lives inside your mind. Obedience is internalized. You've been trained to seek comfort over cognitive dissonance, to accept authority as synonymous with truth, to defer to consensus rather than confront reality. The Gullah Wars are proof that defiance is possible. The system knows this. That is why it buries rebellion in silence, why it teaches you to respect the chain, why it conditions you to fear truth. And yet the mechanism can be turned against them. Knowledge of the system is power. Recognition of its methods allows you to break free. Every story you uncover that was buried, every fact you remember that they tried to erase, every connection you make between past and present weakens the machinery. Memory is rebellion. Awareness is weaponry. Your mind becomes a fortress, unassailable because you understand the architecture of control. Now imagine a networked rebellion of the mind. Men who refuse the narratives fed to them. Men who trace the patterns, connect the dots, and teach what has been erased. That is the legacy of the Gullah Wars, reimagined in the modern age, resistance not only in physical space, but in consciousness. And like the warriors who used terrain, strategy, and psychology to outwit superior forces, you can learn to navigate the systems of perception that surround you today. This is why you must remember, why you must name, why you must resist. To live in ignorance is to remain a pawn. To understand the machinery is to begin reclaiming sovereignty over your mind. And the first step is seeing the invisible, the lies in plain sight. The narratives imposed, the gaps created intentionally for your obedience. The next descent will show you how those who controlled history created systems of moral manipulation, how guilt, fear, and false narratives were weaponized to ensure that even in victory, the Gullah's influence could be minimized. You will learn that every battlefield defeat was followed by a psychological victory for the oppressors, a template still used today to manufacture consent and suppress rebellion. Brace yourself. The lesson is not abstract. It is immediate. It is personal. Because once you see how control operates, the choice is yours. Do you continue living as a programmed observer, or do you step into the reality that knowledge of history is power, and that power is meant to be claimed? Now that you understand the battlefield and the machinery that erased it, it's time to confront the dimension most people never see, the moral and spiritual architecture of control. History is not only about armies, laws, and media. It is about belief, identity, and the rules imposed upon your mind. The Gullah Wars were crushed not merely with bullets and broken treaties, they were targeted with a subtler weapon, the rewriting of morality itself. Consider this. The enslaved were trained to believe obedience was virtue, defiance was sin, rebellion was evil. Even in moments of strategic brilliance, in ambushes that decimated U.S. troops, they were cast as criminals, as morally corrupt, as savage. Every victory they claimed was reframed into a narrative that justified punishment. The act of rising became the act of sinning. And that moral inversion, turning justice into crime, courage into guilt, is the deepest control of all. It attacks not the body, but the soul. This is why silence works. Silence does more than erase memory. It rewires morality. It conditions generations to accept the terms set by the oppressor. When a story like the Gullah Wars is removed from textbooks, hidden from public discourse, ignored in media, it sends a signal. Obedience is natural. Defiance is dangerous. And if you internalize that, you will self-police. You will suppress the fire within. You will normalize subjugation. But the Gullah understood this intuitively. They carried memory as armor, history as sword. Their songs, rituals, and oral traditions preserved moral truth in the face of imposed lies. Courage was never a crime. Resistance was never wrong. Life outside of bondage was not an illusion, but a promise. And every act of defiance, every ambush, every escape, every hidden village was a statement. Morality is not dictated by law, it is dictated by justice, and justice belongs to the free. This spiritual dimension extends beyond the Gullah themselves. It is a map for anyone seeking liberation from control systems today. Power always seeks to define what is good and bad, safe and dangerous, truth and fiction. And if you accept those definitions unquestioningly, your mind becomes a cage. But the Gullah Wars show another path. Reclaim morality by reclaiming memory. Judge action not by what authority commands, but by what sustains life, liberty, and the courage to act. And here is the critical link to your life now. Institutions, corporations, governments, and media use the same strategy on a grand scale. They manufacture guilt, shame, and fear to keep you compliant. They redefine virtue as obedience and sin as resistance. They frame rebellion as chaos, critical thinking as troublemaking, and curiosity as dangerous. Their ultimate goal is to normalize the cage while convincing you it is natural, inevitable, and moral. The lesson is brutal. Freedom is not given. Truth is not given. Memory is not given. They are seized, carried like a torch in the darkness, defended with intelligence, courage, and persistence. The Gullah Wars are a blueprint. Every ambush in the swamp, every fortified settlement, every song sung by a hidden community, all of it is instruction. It teaches you how to resist not just with weapons, but with strategy, memory, and moral clarity. Now imagine this applied today. You are surrounded by systems that seek to distort perception and manipulate morality. Social media algorithms teach fear, conformity, and distraction. News cycles replace context with outrage, turning nuance into obedience. Education molds your understanding of history, economics, and society to fit a preferred framework. Every day your mind is tested. Every day your memory is curated without your consent. And just like the enslaved in Florida, if you allow this to continue unchallenged, your freedom is consumed slowly, imperceptibly. But you are not powerless. You are listening. That awareness itself is an act of rebellion. Knowledge of the system is the first weapon. Recognition of the lie is the first strike. And memory, your ability to remember the erased, your commitment to truth, is the blade that cuts chains. That is why this descent is dangerous, because once you see the architecture of control, there is no going back. You will begin to perceive manipulation everywhere, to detect omissions, to question the moral framing of every story you are told. The Gullah Wars were a war for life, for land, and for memory. Every ambush was tactical. Every fort was a declaration. Every escaped family was a statement. We will not forget, and we will not obey. And the spiritual lesson is clear. Freedom is inseparable from consciousness. Chains can be broken physically, but if memory and morality are surrendered, true liberation is impossible. From this, one truth emerges. Resistance is not optional. If you desire autonomy, mastery, or power, you must become a guardian of memory, a curator of truth, and a defender of moral clarity. Just as the Gullah protected their communities, you must protect our mind from narratives designed to enslave it. You must learn to read between omissions, to see the patterns of deception, and to preserve the truths that others would bury. The next descent will bring the lessons of strategy and self-mastery to the forefront. We will examine how the Gullah organized, how they sustained rebellion for decades, and how you can apply these principles to your own life, not as soldiers in the swamp, but as men navigating the modern battlefield of perception, influence, and personal power. Once you understand their methods, their endurance, and their moral courage, you will see that the war is not just history, it is a mirror, and the man who stares into it cannot remain unchanged. Now we arrive at the point where history becomes a mirror, where the rebellion of the Gullah and Black Seminoles becomes a blueprint for mastery, strategy, and survival in a world built to control you. If you have followed this far, you are no longer a passive observer. You are a witness to erased truth, a student of power, and a man confronting the machinery of obedience. This section will teach you how to take that knowledge and turn it into action, not with muskets in swamps, but with the weapons of perception, discipline, and cunning. First, understand the principle of terrain. The Gullah thrived because they knew their environment. Swamps, rivers, and forests were allies. They could vanish, strike, and reappear at will. They made the land work for them. You must apply the same principle to the modern world. Your terrain is information, opportunity, influence, and perception. Know the landscape of your life, your workplace, your social network, your digital environment. Identify where you are exposed, where the opposition can strike, and where you can move unseen. Strategy begins with understanding your battlefield. Second, mastery of alliances. The Black Seminoles did not fight alone. They partnered with Seminole warriors, shared intelligence, coordinated movements, and protected each other's families. They understood the exponential power of unity. In your life, this translates into relationships. Surround yourself with men who think critically, who question narratives, who are willing to act when others hesitate. Build networks of loyalty, trust, and shared vision. Alone, you are prey. Together, you are untouchable. Third, adaptability. The Gullah fought armies twice their size with nothing but ingenuity. When one tactic failed, they adapted immediately. Ambushes, diversions, false retreats. They learned from every encounter, using failures as fuel for future victories. you must cultivate the same resilience. Every challenge, every obstacle, every manipulation you encounter is a lesson. Learn faster than the system can react. Bend, but never break. Move, but never vanish from your purpose. Fourth, secrecy and timing. The Gullah were masters of invisible operations. They knew that revealing all at once leads to destruction. Timing was everything. A strike too early or too visible could have cost lives. In modern life, knowledge and action must be measured. Do not broadcast your strategy to the world. Learn quietly, plan meticulously, and strike decisively. The less they know, the more power you wield. Fifth, memory as weapon. The Gullah Wars teach that remembering is rebellion. They preserved knowledge through oral tradition, songs, and coded signals. In your life, memory is more than recall. It is context, discernment, and the ability to detect manipulation before it takes root. Keep records, observe patterns, and trust what you see and hear, not what you are told to believe. The truth is always hidden, but always present for those who seek it. Sixth, moral clarity. Obedience was imposed on the enslaved through guilt and fear. The Gullah rejected that false morality. They acted according to justice, courage, and survival. You must cultivate the same compass. Do not let fear, shame, a societal expectation dictate your actions. Let principles, not permission, guide you. Men who master themselves are immune to manipulation because they recognize deception and act regardless of external validation. Seventh, endurance. The Gullah sustained a war for decades against a far stronger opponent. They outlasted generals, survived betrayals, and preserved their people. You must adopt the same long-term perspective. Real power is not measured in short bursts of success, but in consistent persistence against pressure and opposition. Endurance transforms knowledge into wisdom, strategy into legacy, and rebellion into liberation. Finally, awareness of the machinery. Everything you have seen, the erasure of history, the manipulation of morality, the construction of obedience, is a reminder. Systems of control are designed to perpetuate themselves. They are efficient, adaptive, and relentless. Your task is not merely to survive them, but to anticipate, outthink, and outmaneuver them. Knowledge alone is insufficient. You must combine it with discipline, action, and strategic patience. Understand this. The Gullah Wars were more than history. They were an operating manual for men who refused to be controlled. Every ambush, every escape, every hidden village teaches you how to navigate oppression, how to reclaim memory, and how to act with purpose in a world designed to erase truth. The lessons are brutal, precise, and timeless. The descent is nearly complete. By now you have seen history erased, battles hidden, leaders betrayed, and memory weaponized against the oppressed. You have confronted moral manipulation, psychological warfare, and systemic control. You have witnessed strategy, courage, and resilience in their purest form. And now, having internalized these truths, you stand at the edge of transformation. The final descent, Section 10, will reveal the ultimate truth of the Gullah Wars, connecting past rebellion directly to your capacity for personal sovereignty, mastery, and power. It will reveal how the shadows of history, once illuminated, can forge men who are unbreakable, unmanipulated, and awake to the invisible forces that shape every aspect of life. This is the final descent. Here is where history becomes prophecy, where memory becomes power, where the shadow of the Gullah Wars reaches across centuries to touch you, to challenge you, to awaken something in you that cannot be erased. Listen carefully. What you have learned is not entertainment. It is dangerous knowledge, the kind that changes a man forever once he absorbs it. The Gullah Wars ended on the surface with betrayal, forced migration, and erasure. But beneath the surface, they never ended. The spirit of defiance, the insistence on memory, the refusal to submit, all of it survived. In the swamps of Florida, in the hidden settlements of Mexico, in the stories whispered from parent to child, the flame burned on. That flame is a metaphor for power itself. True power is never given. It cannot be granted by law, by system, by authority. It must be seized, nurtured, and defended. Now, look at yourself. You have descended through centuries of hidden history, through strategies erased and leaders forgotten. You have seen how control operates, how narrative shapes obedience, how morality is twisted, how perception is curated. You have traced the methods of those who resist, and you have internalized them. And here is the ultimate truth. The battle is not over, it is within you. The same forces that erased the Gullah Wars are at work in your mind, in your society, in your world. Obedience, distraction, fear, and manipulated memory, these are the modern chains. And just as the Gullah refused them, so must you, not with muskets, but with discipline. Not with ambushes, but with strategy. Not with retreat, but with relentless awareness. Every moment you spend questioning, learning, remembering, acting. You are fighting a rebellion that spans centuries. Every act of clarity, of courage, of moral integrity, you are adding to the legacy of the men and women they tried to erase. You are also becoming a sentinel of memory. The world around you thrives on forgetfulness. People accept the narratives fed to them, obey silently, and surrender their sovereignty of thought. You, however, are awake. You have witnessed the machinery of erasure and understood its architecture. You have learned the tactics of resistance. You now carry the responsibility to remember, to teach, to protect, to act. Here is the most critical insight. Rebellion is not always loud. The Gullah fought in silence, in shadows, and in whispers. Yet their rebellion reshaped the world, left scars on empires, and carved out spaces of freedom. Similarly, your actions need not be broadcast to matter. Thoughtfulness, discernment, preparation, and moral clarity. These are your ambushes, your hidden forts, your network of power. The world will underestimate you. Let it. Let them think you obedient. Then strike in ways that matter. And one final lesson, endurance. The Gullah Wars lasted decades. Rebellion is rarely a single moment of heroism. It is a lifetime of choices. It is persistence when all hope seems lost. It is carrying memory through betrayal, through erasure, through exhaustion. You too will face moments designed to break you. The difference is that armed with knowledge, strategy, and moral clarity, you will persist, you will survive, you will transform. So now stand in the shadow of their legacy. Let the stolen names echo in your mind. Osceola, John Horse, the countless unnamed women and men who refused to kneel. Let their courage, their strategy, their moral clarity shape you. Let the machinery that tried to erase them teach you vigilance, patience, and cunning. Let the memory of their rebellion awaken your own fire, the fire that cannot be chained, the fire that refuses manipulation, the fire that sees as through illusions and acts with purpose. The Gullah Wars are no longer lost. They live in your awareness. They live in your memory. They live in your choices, your actions, and your refusal to accept the stories fed to you without question. You are now part of a continuum of resistance. You are now a witness, a student, and a guardian of forbidden truth. And remember this always. Knowledge is dangerous, but it is also liberating. The moment you internalize it, you can never be fully controlled again. You carry in you the legacy of men and women who bled, fought, and endured against impossible odds. You carry the blueprint of strategy, moral clarity, and resilience that allowed them to defy history itself. Rise with that knowledge. Move through the world aware, disciplined, and unstoppable. The chains of control are not absolute. Memory is your weapon. Understanding is your shield. Action is your sword. And the legacy of the Gullah Wars is your guide. You have descended into forbidden history. You have seen the mechanisms of power. You have witnessed the courage that refused to be erased. And now you are changed forever.